When Stellaris was released, nearly a decade ago, it didn't just change the Space 4X genre, it quickly became the Space 4X genre. This isn't to discount the precious few subsequent games that have tried to move the genre forward, but I don't think there's any denying that Stellaris enjoys a dominant position, to put it mildly. Personally, I couldn't get enough of it, yet after playing it for nigh endless hours, my thoughts can't help but turn again to the beginning, to the first Space 4X game I ever played. 1999's Imperium Galactica 2, a Hungarian underdog that to this day outdoes Stellaris in a few key areas. I still have my original jewel case, containing the game's glorious 4 non-DVD CDs. I even remember exactly where I got it, too. The EB Games at my local mall. This was before EB Games was acquired by GameStop, a rapidly failing Funko Pop retailer. Anyway, Imperium Galactica 2. I should state right off the bat, I realize it's not quite the same kind of Space 4X as Stellaris. After all, Stellaris is a nigh endlessly replayable random story engine, in contrast to Imperium Galactica 2's 3 major campaigns. But while IG-2 isn't the multi-layered sandbox Stellaris is, it more than makes up for it in some truly striking ways. Let me start with what I'll argue is the most important difference between Stellaris and IG-2. In a word, learnability. If you're any degree of familiar with the Space 4X genre, you might not be surprised to hear that it has an onboarding problem. Even traditional real-time strategy games require significantly more verbs from the player than FPS games, platformers, or what have you, but Space 4X games are without question a cut above. There are endless kinds of resources to keep track of, bizarre movement mechanics, tons of invisible systems hiding behind arcane menus, and baffling combat systems requiring obscene levels of finicking to make the most out of. There's many, many reasons why people bounce off these kind of games, and Stellaris kinda has all these and more, with yet more layers that will assuredly be added in the future. In hindsight, Stellaris feels like a capstone game, only really approachable if you're fluent in an existing dialect of Space 4X game. It was a massive beneficiary of all the games that preceded it, subtly training potential players in the conventions of the genre. I legitimately can't imagine somebody who had never played a strategy game at all having Stellaris as their first. If Stellaris legitimately was your first, sound off in the comments because that learning curve seems all but impossible. On the exact opposite end of this spectrum, you find Imperium Galactica 2. It has exactly one resource. Moolah, simoleons, Lutter, fucking money. It also has exactly one movement mechanic. Better hyperdrive equals more faster. It has very readable Empire management screens too, from ship design to diplomacy. Its combat, which I'll get more into later, is about as straightforward as it gets as well. Put simply, it's the perfect entry point to the Space 4X genre. Consequently, I was able to quickly pick it up as a kid, and I played the absolute hell out of it, even getting up early to play it before school, not wanting to start my day without it. Now I realize I'm making Imperium Galactica 2 sound like Babby's first Space 4X here, in direct contrast to the depths of simulation at the height of the genre, that is arguably its greatest strength, but there is something to be said for the genre's lack of modern entry points. This is a market Paradox themselves seem to have identified, recently launching Nexus 5X, which seems to be a simplified, board game-like experience of the genre. The fifth X stands for Express, apparently. You can really see the difference in approachability by comparing Stellaris and Imperium Galactica 2's tutorials. Stellaris has Clippy over here give you more extended advice as you go, leaving you to fill in the broader strokes yourself. Whereas with IG-2, you have a rather comprehensive 5-part tutorial. Mind you, it's not perfect, they probably could have labeled the parts in the menu, for example, but here the bounds of the major systems of the game are firmly established. Now, I'm not saying Stellaris' approach is objectively wrong, but it is notable how reliant the game is on tutorials made by creators on YouTube. All of this is to say that Imperium Galactica 2 is extraordinarily new player friendly, but this is by no means the only way in which it is exceptional. Let's talk about the game's combat systems. Unlike Stellaris, where the combat takes place outside of the player's direct control, here it takes center stage. When a fleet of yours encounters an enemy, the game seamlessly zooms in and you get to control your ships in tactical combat. It's actually a lot like the Total War games. But believe it or not, it would be more accurate to say the Total War games are like this because Imperium Galactica 2 predates the entire Total War series. Admittedly, this tactical combat isn't quite Homeworld, of which IG-2 also came dangerously close to preceding, but it gets the job done. You can even move your ships on the Y-axis, which is useful to avoid excessive damage from weapons fire with huge areas of effect. Beyond that, there's not a whole lot of nuance. You can set targets, use your ship's abilities manually and all, but by and large, the ships can fight on their own just fine. Though there's definitely value in cycling damaged ships out of the line of fire rather than losing them. Simplistic as it is, I like this space combat system a lot. It's baffling to me that we haven't seen more implementations like this. I can't help but feel like Space 4X games have been running further and further away from player involvement in the combat, so having direct command of the ships is quite unique, especially now. But this is only half of the game's combat. The other half is, well, the hill I will die on that Imperium Galactica 2 does better than any of its peers, past or present. You may want to sit down for this one. They made planetary invasion good. I know, right? That feels bizarre to say, believe me. Ground combat has been a long-running issue in essentially every game in the genre. Stellaris wisely patched in planetary surrender mechanics in part just to avoid the whole mess, in certain kinds of wars, even quietly rolling the largely unused general leader type into the new combined commander leader type. Other games don't fare much better. I remember being floored that Amplitude, the developers of the Endless Space games, had even gone through the effort of creating art assets visualizing the infantry of different species. And yet, a quarter century ago, Imperium Galactica 2 impossibly squared this circle. Invasions take place in glorious 3D, with you commanding a force of tanks, fighting enemy tanks and fortifications. Also, unlike essentially every game in the genre, you don't need to worry about making specific transport ships. Your combat ships can carry enough tanks without compromises to their space combat effectiveness, eliminating one of the larger annoyances that I would argue plagues many planetary invasion systems. These tank units aren't just an afterthought either. They have their own entire tech tree of upgrades to work with. Fail to invest in tank research and you can easily wind up Bay of Pigsing yourself. Not a good place for a T-700. With enough care though, you can handle pretty much anything the game can throw at you. Now while I maintain it's the best planetary invasion system in the genre, I should probably qualify a few things. You might recall I said they made planetary invasion good, not great. There are more than a few issues that hold it back. For example, pathfinding kinda sucks. Your tanks can veer off their expected paths, and you often have to micro them to not stack up and block each other as they immediately stop when in range of their target. Admittedly, expecting modern RTS quality pathfinding from a game released in 1999 is not really fair. Fucking StarCraft released the year prior, a game which decidedly did not have perfect pathfinding. If even Blizzard in their prime couldn't get it right, I think it's a bit much to expect other contemporaneous studios to. Even still, it's a bit of a drag to deal with playing it present day. Yet it's still far and away the best invasion system I've ever seen in this kind of game. The only thing I can think of that even remotely comes close is Star Wars Empire at War's ground battles. And if you haven't played it, last I can recall, the meta there most of the time is simply to use a speeder to get vision on the enemy base and bomb it from orbit. Riveting. But I can't sass it too much, the space battles were pretty sweet, even with the ground battles playing a painful second fiddle. Anyway, back to IG-2. I should mention that if you don't like either of these combat systems, you can select an option to always auto-resolve either of them independently of each other. Which is very thoughtful because even while I maintain the ground combat system is at minimum good, it still does get repetitive when fighting larger empires, particularly in the endgame. I don't think I could ever get sick of watching major space engagements though. But hold on, let's go back a bit. You're probably wondering how these fully 3D colonies are created to begin with. Well, you actually get to place the buildings yourself. Colony management is another area where IG2 diverges significantly from genre convention. There's even a lengthy tech tree just for buildings. This kind of smart, walkable, mixed-use urbanism would be illegal to build in most US cities. To be clear, you don't have to place literally every building manually. There are a sizable set of colony automation modes which work as designed. Even still, there's an undeniable thrill in starting construction of an important new structure yourself, particularly in the early game, or even setting up a slew of fortifications to harden a planet against potential ground invasion. As ostensibly cool as this system is, there are issues. For one thing, you have to dig through the building section of the research menu to even find out what each building actually does. It's hard not to miss the detailed tooltips of Stellaris. More annoyingly, the morale-improving buildings don't specify how much they actually improve morale. Park, bar, stadium, rec center, all different shapes and sizes, their relative impacts unclear. One would think that the more expensive facilities would have a bigger impact, but it's extremely unclear how the system actually works. Beyond these morale buildings, as you might expect, you have to provide for the basic needs of your colonists, like healthcare with this FBI, open up! Careful colony management is a good way to get more tax revenue out of your citizens. If you fulfill their needs and build some morale buildings, you can get away with higher tax rates, which you can set on a planet-by-planet basis. I get a kick out of how the highest tax rate is literally oppressive. Yeah, put that on a tax form. There's also trade profits that can be made from neutral traders flying through your space if you have certain buildings set up. But this doesn't scale particularly well in the late game when nigh on every planet is competing for trader attention, so taxes collected every month are gonna be your bread and butter. Aside from generating revenue, your planets also construct your spaceships and tanks in literal spaceship and tank factories. Building more of these allows you to construct things significantly faster, though one should be careful not to overbuild your production capacity, as there's a very interesting quirk as to how manufacturing works here. Unlike Stellaris and others, where when you order the construction of a ship, the entire cost is immediately deducted from your resources, here you continually invest your treasury over the duration of the production job. So, in short, if you overbuild your production, you won't get much out of it if you run out of money halfway through the month, stalling construction progress. This system adds a hefty feeling to each ship, as they take quite a lot of money and time to produce. Definitely a less is more situation. There's also continuous build options where you can even repeatedly build in a rotation, allowing you to fine-tune ratios of your produced ships without resorting to manual queuing. You can easily set rally points with a click, too. Far from being merely structurally simple, Imperium Galactica 2 offers you a pretty sizable number of genuine conveniences. They really put in the extra work to make the game as playable as possible all the way back in 1999, and as a result, it remains exceptionally playable to this day. But if you really want to see where they went above and beyond, you need to see how IG2 handled its event system. Let's talk cutscenes. Back in the 90s, a good many Space 4X games kicked off with a single intro cutscene to set the mood. More modern games like Endless Space 2 keep this tradition alive with unique intro and victory cutscenes for each playable faction. Stellaris, despite having some truly, and I'm being serious here, breathtaking trailers, does not have a single in-game cutscene. Now, given these data points, and those of any other Space 4X games you may have played, how many cutscenes do you think Imperium Galactica 2 has? I promise you, it's more than you'd expect. 43. I count 43 major cutscenes going by the game's video files. These are nicely interspersed throughout each of the 3 main campaigns, and add a tremendous amount of flavor to the experience. For example, the Krahen terraforming cutscene might be my favorite visualization of the concept ever. Again, at the risk of unduly repeating myself, this game was released in 1999. Note, however, I said 43 major cutscenes. If one takes the minor cutscenes into account, the result becomes downright jaw-dropping. You see, not only is Imperium Galactica 2's event system fully voice-acted, it's fully animated.
Emperor, we have a major problem. The intergalactic banking system has malfunctioned.
Going by the game's video files, I count 380 message animations. Of course, many of these are minor variations of each other, but this is still fucking absurd. An unthinkable level of production value in a modern context. Their 3D artists were, as the kids say, cooking. Yes, a lot of these messages boil down to talking heads, sometimes more literally than others, but look at their framing, their movement, and how much more background you can see. Again, this dropped the year after StarCraft, which at the time was arguably the gold standard for talking head animations. As a kid, this blew my socks off. As an adult, this still blows my socks off. You straight up do not see this kind of thing anywhere else. The Galactic Civilizations games have a good number of interspersed high-quality cutscenes, yet they still fall short of this unparalleled level of presentation. Imperium Galactica 2 gets away with this by paring the game down to 3 predefined playable factions, relative to the wider species customization you see in the majority of the genre. Once again, IG2 succeeds in addition through subtraction. What it lacks in customizability, it more than makes up for in terms of personality. The Solarian campaign specifically is where this personality shines the strongest. Solarian being the game's equivalent of human. There's no Earth ever mentioned, so it's pretty safe to assume this is an entirely different timeline. Of the game's 3 campaigns, the Solarian campaign clearly had the most work put into its storytelling. It kicks off with a striking cutscene, featuring the delightful capital ships on the game's cover art. Unfortunately, these never make an appearance in the actual gameplay. You also see a top-tier defensive station that you won't unlock until the very late game. Those inconsistencies aside, it's still a very impressive way to set the tone for the campaign. It also sets up the first plot beats of the story. A Solarian group called the Brotherhood of Tears, which incidentally is also the name of my breakout post-emo shoegaze album, seeks 4 lost data crystals, the so-called Tears. This quest gives you a variety of interesting objectives over the course of the game. I won't go into too much detail on the off chance you're interested in playing through it yourself, as I'd argue it's definitely still worth experiencing, though the exposition dump you get at the end of the questline might have been doled out a little more organically. Anyhow, in much the same way as most Stellaris origins, IG2's event system pulls in both main plot-related events as well as a great many random events. Interestingly, some events appear to be gated behind different difficulty settings. As you might expect, a few events on the lower difficulty settings help push the player in the right direction, but there's also a few events I swear I've only seen on the normal or even hard settings. Some of these events are pretty out there. For example, you can make peace with a group of space pirates by you, diegetically the Space Emperor, marrying a pirate princess after defeating her in semi-honorable combat. Alternatively, you can have her become a fleet commander fighting for you. Her ship is less than stellar though, and because it's an event ship that doesn't upgrade, it quickly falls off even harder. That's definitely a familiar feeling in Stellaris. Much like Stellaris, having a ship with a slower drive technology in your fleet slows down the entire stack. And in the endgame, you really can't afford anything less than the maximum speed, as the strategic layer often devolves into a game of Pac-Man. I should also mention the event system kindly lets you deficit spend a bit so you never run the risk of missing out on an event outcome. Stellaris, in my opinion, would benefit from having this kind of thing, instead of having to keep the event window active and cracking open the trade interface every time. Overall, I would say the Solarian campaign on normal is where the game hits its stride, though I would recommend pushing it to hard if you're an expert in the Space 4X genre. Do expect some save scumming though, because the harder difficulties don't mess around. Looking back at my footage, it took me about 8 hours to get through the Solarian campaign, which feels about right. The game gives you plenty of events to work with throughout the entire campaign, with the only real downturn in enjoyment being the endgame mop-up, but even that goes relatively quickly with the auto-resolve settings on. The other campaigns are nothing to sneeze at either. They have entirely different sets of events, complete with different voice actors and animations. Even radically different playstyles, too. For example, when playing as the Craw Hen, you might notice 3 whole Empire management screens grayed out in the interface, spelling out what the Craw Hen are about quite clearly. There's also the Shinari, which are not dissimilar from Star Trek's Ferengi. They have weaker ships than the Solarians and the Craw Hen, but get sizable bonuses to commerce and espionage. Taken together, these 3 campaigns give the game quite a lot of replay value, particularly with the event variation. There's also a good set of scenarios, including a skirmish mode. This lets you play as the other alien factions you encounter in the game, but without the event system, the magic isn't really there. It is undeniably cool to use the different ship designs though, each faction's ships having their own distinct look. On that note, I can't believe I've gone this long without mentioning what absolute feasts the graphics and sounds are. The aesthetics are magnificent. While I'm confident some of these interfaces would almost certainly be rejected by modern UX designers for being too busy, I think they're absolutely incredible. The interface really sells the idea of controlling the levers of power for a spacefaring civilization. And the music, Lord Almighty, the music. If you've seen some of my other videos, you might have noticed I often use the IG-2 soundtrack as background music. Even if the tracks admittedly don't have all that much to do with the content of the videos, they still convey a great deal of emotion. Funnily enough, much like the transcendent Terran music from the original StarCraft, unceremoniously named Terran 1 through 3, the best tracks on the Imperium Galactica 2 soundtrack are aptly named Human 1 through 3. Of them, the best song in the game, Human 3, is pure ear candy. It's absolute perfection. Beyond the sublime music, the game also has a rather amusing visual signifier that you might have picked up on by now. Everything that can spin, will spin. Spin! The research options spin, the building selections spin, the vehicles under construction spin, even the fleet icons on the star map spin. The main menu itself spins. Shit, maybe all that spinning is what really entranced my autistic ass as a kid. Now again, I'm not really a UX guy, but I'd say this motion makes the interface feel much more alive. I could totally see it annoying some people though, particularly as in many cases the assets are probably not supposed to spin quite that fast. This, regrettably, brings me to the game's outstanding issues. The good news is that there's no hard and fast blockers, at least that I encountered on the Steam version. It even looks great on a 4K HDR monitor, which I can't even begin to tell you how happy it makes me compared to other games of that hardware generation. However, the game did not quite anticipate being run at modern frame rates. The enhanced rotational velocity is a fun side effect to be sure, but less fun is not being able to specify production numbers or split fleets accurately. Even certain screen elements like the bottom left colony pane can be very click temperamental, often picking up a single click twice. The frame rate also impacts the pacing of event messages. The text scroll is much faster than the voice acting, and when the next part of the conversation begins in the text, it interrupts the current speech, starting the new section. This doesn't come up all that often, as most messages are a single block, but still, it's annoying on the larger ones. I read in various places the solution for this is to manually crank down the frame rate of your monitor, but with respect, I didn't buy an Odyssey Neo G7 to manually fiddle with the settings every time I want to play certain games. I should also say, with HDR on, the game leaves the screen extra dark every time I close it, but that's easily fixed by hitting the Windows Graphics Driver refresh shortcut, which is Win-Control-Shift-B. Yeah, I bet you didn't think you'd be getting tech advice from this video, but this one may serve you well in certain situations, if you remember it. Anyway, like I said earlier, these issues are by no means deal breakers, and I was able to beat the Solarian campaign just fine on normal. Setting aside the game's light technical issues, there's thankfully not much in the way of problems to speak of. I already mentioned the campaign's mop-up phase is a bit of a drag, but let's be honest, the mop-up phase in every 4X, Total War, Grand Strategy, or what have you, is invariably a drag. It is a persistent issue within the genre. It would be a bit much to expect IG-2 to have solved that one in addition to all the other contemporary problems it actually does successfully resolve. If there's one major issue I have with the game, it's that the alliance mechanic alluded to in the game's full title, Imperium Galactica 2 Alliances, is rather underbaked. On normal difficulty or above, the other empires want nothing to do with you but your space. In the endgame of the Solarian campaign, when you discover a dire galactic threat that you're supposed to unify the galaxy against, in exactly the same way as Stellaris' endgame crises, there's a real good chance that all the other factions are dead, either by said galactic crises' hand or yours, even if you are only acting in self-defense. Maybe the diplomatic possibilities are more pronounced for the Shinari, but it does feel like a miss for it not to be much of a factor in the game's standout campaign. All the same, I don't believe any of these issues materially hold the game back all that much. It certainly wasn't for lack of quality that we haven't seen anything else quite like it. After Imperium Galactica 2, Digital Reality released Hegemonia: Legions of Iron, which, if you've seen my EVE Online video, you'll recall was the beginning of quite a journey for me. The game itself, though, seems to have been judged pretty harshly by history, going by the very few Steam reviews it has. Hegemonia takes more than a few steps back from traditional 4X gameplay, more of a mission-based RTS with some light 4X-ish elements. This isn't to say it's without charm, however. Its first act is probably the closest we'll ever get to an Expanse strategy game, with Earth and Mars squaring off because of the destruction of a civilian ship by a mysterious third party and all. But setting aside my hagiography of Hegemonia, it is undeniably a disappointment as a follow-up to Imperium Galactica 2. Of course, from a business perspective, it makes perfect sense they made what they did. The 4X market was clearly a smaller target than the at the time blossoming real-time strategy market. Moreover, one can't help but imagine after IG2 they were desperate to not attempt a project quite on that scale again. Beyond Hegemonia, Digital Reality stuck around a decade, creating quite a few games in a variety of different genres. Of them, I've admittedly only played Sin and Mora, which I will always remember as the shmup where you fight a Bagger 288. Now, despite Digital Reality never touching the property again, this wasn't supposed to be the end of the series. Mythos Entertainment, another Hungarian developer, was at one point tasked with creating an Imperium Galactica 3. However, this eventually fell apart, with them losing the license. Surprisingly, the project was salvaged, and it went on to become Nexus: The Jupiter Incident, arguably one of the best tactical space combat games ever made. Yet this was even further from an Imperium Galactica 3 than Hegemonia was. It's tragic to think about what the Space 4X genre missed by not getting a fully featured Imperium Galactica 3, especially one with this combat system. Also tragic is that despite Nexus's quality, it failed to meet Kickstarter goals for a sequel. A real shame it didn't get funded instead of Star Citizen. So where does this leave the series today? Well, there's good news and there's bad news. The good news is that the IP is in the hands of a publisher who is actively publishing high-quality games. The bad news is that it's the Embracer group, which, if I recall correctly, has been more than a little trigger-happy on canceling projects that they didn't see as a sure thing. In that environment, what chance would a theoretical Imperium Galactica 3 have? I'd like to imagine they'd eventually get greedy for that Stellaris money and greenlight something, in the same way that more than a few seem to be vying for that Civilization money these days. I suppose the other problem is that vanishingly few studios even seem capable of making high-quality Space 4X games. Even still, hope springs eternal. Maybe Sins 2 or Homeworld 3 will reinvigorate interest in space strategy across all the various subgenres. Or not, but that's another video. All told, Imperium Galactica 2 was so far ahead of its time that its time arguably hasn't even come yet. Judged on its unique strengths, it has no equals. Yet, regrettably, the game appears to have been treated as an evolutionary dead end by the wider genre. But as I hope I have successfully shown you, there is a lot that can still be learned from it. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not calling for some kind of goofy-ass Rit Vern here, or Rit 4X Earn, even. it would be foolish to ignore the sizable improvements made by subsequent games in the genre. Stellaris, for instance, has had so much post-release work put into it that it's the ship of Theseus in game form, a new game multiple times over from where it began. It defines the modern Space 4X genre precisely because its developers worked for it, seeking to perfect and expand the vision. Still not paying $19.99 for Astral Planes though. One way or another, I hope we'll see a Space 4X game worthy of Imperium Galactica 2's mantle someday. Perhaps the advancement of modern game engines and frameworks will eventually make development of such a work more realistic, ideally without relying on soulless AI-created assets. But until then, Imperium Galactica 2 deserves to be recognized for what it did and continues to do best. Hey, thanks for watching. If you're hardcore enough to have made it through this entire video, you'll probably want to subscribe and check out some of my other videos. Very good odds you'll find something that strikes your interest. Thanks again,